Welcome to Day 2, Session 2 of the Emerging Scholars Symposium, a partnership brought to you specifically by the Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower Presidential Libraries, and more broadly from the National Archives and Records Administration, of which the Presidential Library System is an important part. The Emerging Scholars Program is brings you cutting-edge information and insight from a group of scholars who are relatively new to the world of research, scholarship, and the presenting of their findings on a national stage. So we're getting in on the ground floor of what I'm sure are going to be some fantastic careers in the world of research and scholarship. I'm Jeff Urban. I'm from the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. I'll be your host and moderator, and I'm so pleased that you've taken some time this afternoon to tune in and spend some time with us and the scholars. I'm sitting in for my friend and colleague, Joy Murphy, who is the Education Director at the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum, and I'm delighted to be bringing you talented young scholars that we're hearing from this week. Next up, we have Dr. Benjamin Schneider. He has a BA in history from the University of Rochester. He has a MA in history from the George Washington University and a PhD in history from George Mason University. He's written quite a bit, and his work has appeared in the Journal of Contemporary History and War and History, and he's currently working on a manuscript To Hate and Kill, American War Criminals and the Failure of American Military Justice in the Second World War. We welcome you, Benjamin. Thank you for being here. Please tell us about your work.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to be talking to you all today about the problem of war crimes and extralegal violence in war, and we're going to be talking specifically about how Dwight D. Eisenhower faced some difficult options in trying to deal with that problem. More specifically, how to deal with that problem after the fact. The Second World War was the largest and most violent conflict in human history, and as I'm sure you are all aware, in the German and Japanese armies saw a level of brutality that was, if not unprecedented, then at least unusual. The American army had not suffered from the same sorts of degeneration, moral and otherwise, but even there, the problems of total war meant that some American soldiers used violence outside of legal bounds. American soldiers committed murders, rapes of German, Italian, French, English civilians, prisoners of war. And of course, by the war's end, there was an understanding that there would need to be an accounting for all of these occurrences. And so, of course, Dwight D. Eisenhower is tasked with both the problem of dealing with German war criminals in the European theater and also dealing with his own army, in which he was command and for whom he was responsible. So today I'm going to talk about his efforts in 1945 to try to find, investigate, and prosecute all those American soldiers, enlisted and officers who were responsible for killing Axis prisoners of war, and why those efforts failed, and why, in the main, those were forgotten after the war was done. So, without further ado, let us begin. If I could get the next slide, please. The war is over. Yay, 1945, VE Day. The Nazi regime has collapsed. The war is concluded. And now the question is what to do in the peace. And so the three Allied powers, or four Allied powers, the Russians, the French, the British, the Americans, have to figure out how to deal with the problem of Nazi criminality, what to do about the concentration camps, about the systematic extermination of European Jewry, about the use of terror bombing, terror on the part of the SS against civilian populations of Europe. And of course, next slide, please. The goal is to engage in criminal trials for all those soldiers and statesmen who had violated the laws of armed conflict, and for some of those who had violated moral law so egregiously that a new category of legal infraction would be invented, that of crimes against humanity. But if the US Army and their allies were going to put Germans in the dock for violating the laws of armed conflict, they're going to have to start asking questions about their own conduct. If, as it turned out, American soldiers had also on occasion shot prisoners of war, had also on occasion killed or raped civilians, then there would immediately come the question, was this simply victor's justice? Was this simply the conquering army imposing punishment on the defeated army for actions that it itself had committed? And Dwight D. Eisenhower was very sensitive, having liberated the concentration camps and witnessed the horrors and brutality of the German regime, of those allegations. Next slide, please. So in July of 1945, he issues an order to the entire army that says, you will forthwith cause a thorough investigation to be made into whether enemy prisoners of war have been killed or otherwise mistreated by members of your command, and whether instructions have been given leading to such treatment or practices have been condoned, and to take disciplinary action where appropriate. This was not simply a prophylactic measure. Eisenhower wanted this investigation because he knew for a fact that American soldiers had engaged in such crimes, and indeed a number of these had come across his desk, some of which very serious, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But he wanted to make sure that there were no other surprises waiting for him, and that he would not, in the process of trying to ensure that Nuremberg trials came off without a hitch, be sidelined by allegations against Americans and their conduct during the war. Next slide, please. If I could get that slide a little larger, please. Thank you. The report was conducted across all those units exercising general court-martial jurisdiction, and the findings were as follows. In general, very few serious incidents are revealed by the reports so far received, and reveal that adequate corrective action has been taken or it is now too late. The passage of time and the death and departure of witnesses have made it impossible to gather definitive evidence fixing responsibility upon individuals, which is to say that we did everything that we could, and all those things that we can do have been done, and that there is nothing left for the United States Army to do. Everything was fine. Nothing was wrong. Everything was good. Next slide, please. A little larger, if you don't mind. And there was, however, a sour note in all of this. Numerous reports of serious violations are adumbrated by rumor and general impression among the men interviewed. These are in the main grossly exaggerated, part of the folklore of war, isolated incidents that have been magnified and multiplied in the retelling. This meant, of course, was that when asked, a large number of American soldiers said that they did know of incidents where Axis prisoners had been shot by American forces, where American officers had ordered the execution of Axis POWs. But, said the Army, these were the folklore of war. Soldiers' stories traded around a campfire, something that was a minor, negligible part of the fighting there. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to explore a little bit more deeply the nature of this report and why I think its conclusions are incorrect, and the forces that led to the Army coming to these conclusions despite what I would suggest is a significant body of evidence that was not, in fact, the correct conclusion. Next slide, please. The report suffered from three major failings, some of which are alluded to in the text that we talked about just a moment ago. First of which is the problem of demobilization. By 1945, indeed by 1944, the United States Army is beginning to shed members, and it is beginning to shed members that are the most combat experienced, that have been on the continent for the longest, and are the most likely individuals to know about these incidents and to be able to offer reliable witness testimony. Of course, there's also the problem of the method of this investigation. Dwight D. Eisenhower simply sends out an order to all units exercising general court-martial jurisdiction, asking if any of their officers or any of their soldiers had shot prisoners of war or had ordered the same. Now, I think understandably, this is not perhaps the best methodology because you are asking someone if they or their subordinates have committed war crimes which you are about to begin trying the Germans for in large numbers. You're asking them essentially if they would like to be court-martialed. And I think understandably the answer for most people is no, I would not like to be court-martialed for things that took place during the war. And of course, the last piece of this is that the Eisenhower report would not, perhaps could not deal with the failure of the military justice system to handle these kinds of cases as had been intended during the war. Because what will be revealed in even those small number of cases that are examined by the report is that the court-martial system was not equal to the task, and that many of those accused of such crimes would be released perhaps unjustly and with light sentences in all cases. So those are the three main things that we're going to cover here, and I will discuss in a little bit more detail the how and why of each of these pieces. All right. So our first major problem is demobilization. Beginning in 1944, the Army starts to rotate members of the uniformed services back to the United States. Number of soldiers at this point have been in combat for a long period of time. They have been wounded or have suffered mental degradation from their time in combat, or have simply been away from their families for so long that it begins to become a problem of morale. And so the Army sets a quota of about 1% of troops per month, which will total about 15% of the entire Army by VE Day, that had been in theater, that had experienced combat there, and are now no longer on the continent of Europe, which means they are no longer available for questioning, and in many cases are not in the Army at all, and therefore out of the reach of the military justice system, since only uniformed members in this time period can be tried by courts-martial. They cannot be recalled to service, no matter what crimes they are alleged to have committed, and the civilian justice system, interestingly enough, is not able to try them for crimes committed in uniform. So that means that anybody who gets back to the United States is fully out of reach of the legal system. After the war ends, you have another problem, which is that men who have fought for 1 or 2 or 3 or more years are ready to go home. They're ready to see their families. They've done their part. They've fought the war. They do not see any reason why they need to remain on the continent any longer. And so the Army suffers from an acute crisis of morale after VE Day, as soldiers press to be released from the uniform as quickly and rapidly as possible. And according to the Army's own internal histories, by the summer of 1945, many units in the Army will be in a state of near mutiny. Discipline will be in tatters, and the Army has to demobilize as rapidly as possible to maintain good order and discipline and to keep the occupation of Europe functioning, which means that most divisions in Europe will lose about 45% of their strength by the time Eisenhower is issuing his order for comprehensive investigation. Those people that are leaving, those people that are demobilized, are going to be concentrated amongst those individuals with the most points, which is to say those individuals who fought in the combat arms, who had the longest time on the line, those individuals who are the likeliest to have seen or inflicted violence on other human beings, which is to say those people who are most likely to have been useful witnesses or perpetrators of these sorts of crimes. And the last piece here, of course, is that you are beginning to shrink the Army and its organizational structure, not simply turn over its personnel. And so 1 Army, 3 Corps, and 11 divisions are going to be disbanded by 1945, which means all of their headquarters personnel, all of their archival records, all of their court-martial records, all of their investigative records are going to come with them back to the States, or will be destroyed for being not historically significant and shredded before those units leave the continent, which means that those formations will no longer be able to provide the kind of evidence or investigations or data necessary to conduct a thorough and comprehensive accounting. Next slide, please. And of course, you have to deal with the last and perhaps most troubling part of this, which is the fact that an awful lot of people get killed or wounded in the course of this war. And so I have here a graph for you. This is days in combat on your x-axis versus percentage casualties on your y-axis. Each of those dots represent the 61 American infantry divisions that are on the continent of Europe. And you will see that that is a linear function. The more days in combat, the more casualties you take. For those of you who are doing math from the cheap seats, it's about 180 days before the average infantry division suffers 100% casualties. That is 100% of the members of that unit being killed, wounded, or captured, unable to continue. If you look on the far right end of this, you will note that the 4th Infantry Division, all the way up there at the top, suffers 252% casualties. They land on June 6th on D-Day and will continue to fight through to the end of the war. Their 22nd Infantry Regiment will take 435% casualties in the course of the fighting. Now, that's an extreme outlier. That's the worst suffering that you could go through in this war, but other units suffer along that same trajectory, which means that by the end of the 11 months of fighting, an enormous number of people who are involved in this war are dead, are wounded, and rotated back to the States or sent to other units or to other areas, which means that based on shifting jurisdictions, the records of their crimes, individuals who may have witnessed them doing something against the law, people who they may have witnessed doing something against the law are no longer going to be in their immediate circle. They are going to be useless to the military justice system, to say nothing of the fact that these individuals, if they survive, are more likely to be rotated back to the states during the demobilization process. By the summer of 1945, the army that had fought the war in Europe mostly does not exist anymore. And it is new soldiers, fresh soldiers who have not had any combat experience, who are there to answer Eisenhower's questions. Next slide, please. All right. And of course, we have to deal with the problem of how all of this is conducted. Most of the soldiers who fought the war and responsible for anything that may have gone on are gone, but the units that held them are not. But of course, they have simply been asked, ordered technically, but asked politely to provide information on this subject. And many of them are somewhat lax in actually responding to that particular order. And so only 75 units out of 118 send any sort of response to Eisenhower. Now, some of that will be willful disobedience. Some of that will be that these units are in the process of being demobilized. And of course, before they leave the theater, this is not necessarily the highest item on their to-do list for reasons that are both perhaps practical and self-interested. Next slide, please. Which means that a number of known cases, a number of units that have known cases do not send back, for one reason or another, incidents that they know happened. This is General Orlando Ward, commander of the 20th Armored Division. One of the officers under Ward's command will, in the aftermath of the war, in fact, after VE Day, will come and approach his staff, and he will say to them, got an order from higher headquarters. You know, they don't like to put these things in writing, but these SS men that I've been getting, I don't want them. Take them down a small road and shoot them. You know, they ran. One of his officers would say, my God, I've got 100 of them in prisoner cage right now. I can't just shoot them all. And Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Callahan would say, no, I suppose you can't. Others could. And at least 12 prisoners, SS or not, were taken out in small batches in the course of 4 incidents and shot out of hand. Generally speaking, they were marched down a small road, told to run, and were shot as they fled. Arthur Callahan, 3 lieutenants, and about 24 enlisted men would be implicated in these killings, which were perhaps not the only ones engaged in by the 20th Armored Division, but were the ones that made their way to the military justice system. General Orlando Ward would maintain that those junior officers had only been following the orders of their superiors and therefore were not morally or legally culpable. And using his power as the division commander would void the charges against them. They would not have to face a court. None of the enlisted men would be charged for anything. They, too, were only following orders. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Callahan, the instigator of this entire debacle, would be charged with conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, a charge which had no mandatory sentence of any stripe. You could be given anything from 1 day to execution, and of course was acquitted of that as well. The 20th Armored Division did not report this incident to General Eisenhower. Next slide, please. We have here a member of the 8th Armored Division, Lieutenant Robert Schneeweiss. Schneeweiss was only 2 weeks in combat before he found himself in the small German town of Voerd. He would, one fateful morning, ask the member of his tank crew if they wanted to go on a kraut hunt. And they did, whether coerced or not. They all went into town, brought their weapons with them, proceeded to force their way into a German home, finding 2 occupants there, forced them into the basement. Schneeweiss gave the order, and his men shot those 2 people to death in the basement of their own home. Not yet done, they proceeded to walk outside, walk down the street, where they found 2 women in their late 50s in the garden. They would open fire again. The women were wounded but not killed. Schneeweiss would walk up, casually execute the both of them with his .45 caliber pistol. Not yet done, they would proceed further along their walk, where they saw a man and his son walking through the fields, open fire, again wounding the 2 individuals. Schneeweiss would borrow one of his sergeant's M3 grease guns and proceed to execute those 2 men at close range quite deliberately. Schneeweiss's subordinates were not charged. Schneeweiss was charged with murder. He was convicted somewhat incomprehensibly, as the Judge Advocate Corps would later write, of manslaughter, and was sentenced to 5 years, I believe, and would only serve 3 as part of a letter-writing campaign. The American veterans of Milwaukee would petition on his behalf. Letter writers as far away as California would write in to decry the injustice that Lieutenant Schneeweiss faced. Schneeweiss, of course, was only doing, they said, what the Army had trained him to do, which was to kill the enemy in or out of uniform. And they would note that killing the enemy, whether military or civilian, was, they said, condoned by the Army during wartime. And you can see there on the left-hand side, the headline reads, Milwaukeean jailed for Reich massacre, blame hate lessons. Hate lessons being part of the Army's combat infantry training. Schneeweiss will, of course, be pardoned and will get to spend Thanksgiving at home with his 2 young children and his wife in a way that his victims would not. Next slide, please. 42nd Infantry Division would also be queried as to their conduct during the war. They would not send any report back about what they had gotten up to at Guardhouse B of the Dachau concentration camp. You can see there on the left-hand side both the guard tower and the remaining pile of bodies. About 16 German guards had been sheltering in the tower. They came out with their hands up. The 42nd moved to take possession of their prisoners. There was some pushing and shoving. An American sergeant, no one's quite sure who, opened fire with his weapon, shot one of the men into the canal that runs along the guard tower. The other Americans in the vicinity all opened fire. About 16 Germans would be shot down after surrender. We don't know for sure how many, because of course the bodies were then shoved or fell into the canal and were washed away. You can see there on the right-hand side, the Americans recovering one of them. Next slide, please. Of course, the 42nd was not only getting up to those sorts of shenanigans at Dachau. You can see here by the town of Webling. 42nd, one of its units in action, would have a number of Germans come out of a farmhouse from the basement to surrender. They would proceed, take them, march them a short ways into the woods, line them up, and shoot them, something that the Army Signal Corps recorded, took photos of the aftermath of, noting in the caption on the photograph, note the unusual position of the bodies. The only thing unusual about the position of the bodies being that they were clumped together without weapons, helmet, or any sort of equipment, meaning that they had clearly surrendered, and were so close together they were not in combat formation, because of course if you were all standing clumped in the open, you'd be very dead very, very quickly. And so, of course, the 42nd does not report that incident either. Next slide, please. 45th Infantry Division will also have a number of incidents that it does not report. This is Sergeant Horace West, who in the opening days of the Sicily campaign will be part of an action near the Biscari airfield. He will wind up charged with about 37 German and Italian prisoners, slightly more than that. He will send a small handful back to the prisoner of war cages for interrogation, take a couple of the men that he trusts, will march those individuals off into an olive grove, will borrow a Thompson submachine gun from his first sergeant, and proceed to line up those individuals who've been stripped to the waist and were not wearing any shoes, and shoot them with the Thompson. And then he and the other men with him would proceed to finish off those survivors at close range with their firearms, or in one case, an entrenching tool. Horace West would be convicted of murder. None of his subordinates were. And would serve a stern 1 year in prison before Congress started sniffing around. One of his brothers asked why he had been imprisoned, and in an effort to avoid what Patton would call a stink in the press, they released Horace back into the Army, where he would be put back into a combat unit and would go on to be a decorated sniper. Here you can see some of the press coverage where he claimed to have shot 130 Germans with his sniper rifle to get revenge for a young replacement who had been killed in an action later in the war. Next slide, please. And of course, here we have the 45th Infantry Division in action again at Dachau. This is the coal yard. After Lieutenant William Walsh takes the first 4 Germans who come out of the camp to surrender, herds them into a boxcar, shoots them repeatedly with his pistol, and then has one of his subordinates come in to finish them off. Men of his unit would proceed to round up those guards they could find in the camp, put them into the coal yard, and Walsh would begin assembling men with automatic weapons to liquidate them. And we can see here the aftermath. of that incident. They would open fire. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, in charge of the unit, would manage to stop the shooting, but not before 17 people had been killed and more wounded. 45th Infantry Division would not report this voluntarily to Eisenhower. Next slide, please. Of course, the report did make it to Eisenhower, and the report would maintain, the authors of the report would maintain that it appears that there was a violation of the letter of international law in that the SS guards seemed to have been shot without trial. But in the light of conditions which greeted the eyes of the first combat troops to reach Dachau, it is not believed that justice or equity demand that the difficult and perhaps impossible task of fixing individual responsibility now be undertaken. Which is an interesting set of conclusions to draw, given that we know that that's John Lee on the right there with the BAR, and that's Daniel Drain's machine gun team sitting there in the center, and all of those names were included in the Inspector General's initial report to Eisenhower. 7 American soldiers were listed by name for violations of the laws of armed conflict, and Eisenhower's eventual report would ignore all of them, and they would choose simply not to prosecute those individuals. The Judge Advocate Corps would offer as their explanation for this failure the fact that they did not believe that they could find a court of officers that would be willing to convict any of these men for the crimes that they had committed, and that any trial would therefore be a waste of time. Next slide, please. If I could get that bigger, thank you. Right. So in the end, the final tally, what Eisenhower was able to uncover was 9 reported cases, courts-martial, for prisoner killing, which is 30 short of those that the Judge Advocate General was able to locate. Their final history of the branch office of the JAG for the European Theater would say that there had been 39 cases of POW killing. Only 3 of those 9 cases resulted in unjustified acquittals, which is to say they went to trial and then, without basis in evidence, the individuals were allowed to go. Each court case was reviewed by the Judge Advocate General for correctness. There was no mechanism due to double jeopardy provisions for dealing with unjustified acquittals, but the Judge Advocate noted that the cases had not merited an acquittal. 2 more received sentences of 5 years or less, which we know is a problem because in the United States Army of the period, murder carried one of 2 sentences: life in prison or death. There was no other option. You could not give someone 25 years in jail. You could not give someone 10 years in jail. Anyone who's receiving 5 years or less is being charged on a lesser crime, despite the fact that these are almost certainly murder. 2 more cases had no information whatsoever presented about them in any way, shape, or form. We don't know how many victims there were. We don't know how many officers were involved. We don't know anything about them. The unit simply said, yes, this happened. We tried a case. That's all the information that we feel we need to provide for you. And 4 units with known serious violations that had reached Eisenhower's office by other means simply failed to report those incidents in the course of offering the reports. Next slide. No one, anyone, anywhere, for any reason, is disciplined, reprimanded, or court-martialed as a result of Eisenhower's report. Those units that did not send reports or sent incomplete reports did not receive a reprimand. There was no accountability there. Unjustified acquittals did not result in investigations into how those failures had occurred or seek to correct or punish individuals responsible for them. No rumors were able to be turned into court cases. And of course, in the case of Dachau, there's very explicitly a decision made not to try known named perpetrators. Nothing at all would happen to anyone as a result of this investigation. Next slide, please. Of course, if the Army was not able to admit what had happened just yet, those who had been in it were increasingly able to do so. And here we have Edgar Jones, combat correspondent, writing in The Atlantic in 1946. What kind of war do civilians suppose we fought anyway? We shot prisoners in cold blood, wiped out hospitals, strafed lifeboats, killed or mistreated enemy civilians, finished off the enemy wounded, and tossed the dying in a hole with the dead. Memoirs that would come out in 1946 and 1947 would include claims of crimes against prisoners and civilians. The men who fought this war understood and were frank about what kind of war it was that they had fought. One soldier would say that the generals, citing actually Orlando Ward specifically here, didn't know what the hell they were doing because they were here to fight a clean war. And it wasn't a clean war. It had to be, he said, a dirty war. And it was. Next slide, please. By 1947, the Army was better able to admit what had perhaps been obvious to all from the beginning, the stakes being somewhat lower. A report in 1947 concluded that it happened quite often that any SS men captured in the Munich area were shot at once because of the idea and the feeling of repugnance that the American soldier felt about the depravity of concentration camp guards in general and the Dachau guards in particular. Many American soldiers felt that to permit SS men to surrender was to afford sanctuary to beasts who thus sought to escape the consequences of their heinous actions. This was an offhand comment written in a report, the town of Oberframmen, which asked very politely the United States government to provide to them an explanation for how 5 of its rural policemen wound up dead in a ditch with 2 SS men and 1 member of the Wehrmacht. Concluded that the 42nd Infantry Division, G Company, 222nd Infantry Regiment, was the responsible parties, though no names could be tied specifically to this. Yet another incident that transpired in the 42nd that they did not report to Eisenhower. Now, if the Army and American society were perhaps more willing to entertain the nature of the war that had been fought by the time we reached 1946, 1947, the problem that Eisenhower faced was that the political situation had changed and that now there were greater consequences to dealing with the problem. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. The Eisenhower report showed, I think, conclusively that the Army had no idea how many incidents of prisoner killing had occurred within its ranks. And this was because the Army had not systematically investigated, tried, or prosecuted these cases during the war. The military justice system was not set up to maintain oversight of these sorts of incidents, to deal with this particular problem. And that was not a problem unique to the United States Army. The laws of war in this period dealt much more heavily in something called reprisal. Trials, the idea of an international military tribunal, the idea of trying a war criminal as a criminal at all, was relatively recent and indeed did not particularly predate the First World War, Henry Wirz being an exception to this in the American Civil War. The way in which war criminals were to be punished under the old system of military law was through tit-for-tat reprisal killings. That if one army's members killed the prisoners or civilians of the opposing army, that army could then, on the battlefield, engage in a retaliatory killing to remind the offending party of the stakes of the matter, and that would be considered settled. The Second World War was so brutal, so egregious, so transgressive of any sort of moral or legal norms that that system was no longer viable. And so by 1943, the United States government had committed to trying all war criminals in all armies in a manner akin to those of civilian courts, to investigate, to prosecute, and to imprison or execute violators of the laws of armed conflict. What it could not admit in 1945 was that because it had only made that decision in 1943, it had not built a system capable of reaching those goals prior to the outbreak of the war. And once the war was underway, the situation was so dire that resources could not be devoted to doing it in stride. And so nothing was done until Eisenhower sought to correct the matter in 1945, by which time it was too late to take any corrective action. And that was because, not least, to do so would be a political catastrophe in the atmosphere of the end of World War II and the beginnings of the Cold War. Next slide, please. As you may be aware, by the time we reach 1947, the Soviet Union and the United States, which had been allies, are now increasingly enemies and eyeing each other with deep suspicion across the divided Europe. Next slide, please. Battle lines are increasingly being drawn. Countries are falling into one camp or the other, Western democracies versus communist states in the East. And as time proceeds, Western allies begin to form mutual defense arrangements, NATO being the most explicit of them. And of course, the question now is what to do with Germany. Populous, industrial Germany, Germany on the front lines of the conflict between the West and the Soviet Union. And the answer that the Western powers, the United States in particular, increasingly come to is that Germany, despite its atrocious conduct during the war, despite the excesses and brutalities of the Nazi state, must be made a full member of the alliance against the Soviet Union. They must be at the front lines of a common European defense, which means the German government would have to be rehabilitated and Germany would have to be rearmed. Next slide, please. The problem with that is that if you want to rearm Germany, if you want to rebuild an army for the Germans, you need Germans with military experience. I regret to inform you that those Germans that had sizable military experience were capable of running an army were Nazis, or at least had been members of the Wehrmacht under Nazi rule. And a number of senior officers, when asked by Konrad Adenauer what it would take to build the Bundeswehr, told him very frankly that it would require at least three things. First of which was the release of all Germans convicted of war crimes. Slate would have to be wiped clean. Second, there would have to be an end to the defamation of the German soldier, including those in the SS. There could be no more talk about how they had fought dishonorably, about how they had fought a barbaric war of extermination in the East, about their role in the Holocaust and the extermination of European Jewry, about the crimes committed against French, Polish, Italian, and other civilians in Western Europe. All of that would have to go away. The German government would need to take measures to transform both domestic and foreign public opinion to rehabilitate the German soldier in the eyes of the world, or else, they said, they would take their toys and go home, and NATO could figure it out on their own. Now imagine for a moment that this is the environment in which the United States government begins to think about whether it had failed to prosecute its own war criminals. If Eisenhower were to take a look at his report and to realize its failings, to realize its shortcomings, and to seek to mobilize the Army and the US government to take more forceful action against the men in its ranks who had violated the laws of the armed conflict, he would risk derailing the trials at Nuremberg, to make a circus, particularly given a number of high-ranking American generals who were implicated in a number of these cases, to make a media circus of the proceedings and to calls of moral equivalency between the Allied forces and German forces, which did not exist in any reasonable universe. And as the Cold War proceeded, the risk of alienating American people who would see German war criminals beginning to be treated with kid gloves, while their own war criminals, while the boys who had fought the Nazis, the boys who had not wanted to go to the war in the first place, they would be held to bear the brunt of it. The United States government decided that rather than holding those responsible for criminal conduct during the war to account, there would be a mutual forgetting. Next slide, please. Eisenhower would concede. He would agree to sign a statement presented to him by a group of German generals that would be republished in Stars and Stripes, saying that there's a real difference between the regular German soldier and officer and Hitler and his criminal group. I've come to know that difference. For my part, I do not believe the German soldier as such has lost his honor. Eisenhower would begin, after having admirably made clear to all the extent, the scope, the nature of the Holocaust and taken provision to document and record its horrors, would begin to rehabilitate the reputation of the Wehrmacht, the reputation of the German soldier, and to try to separate those men that would become the core of the Bundeswehr from the criminal element that he saw as being the SS and Hitler's Nazi regime, a distinction which we now know did not in practice exist in any meaningful way. Next slide, please. This was not simply a matter of PR or publicity. Concrete steps were taken. By 1948, the US government ceased to present war crimes cases against minor German war criminals and ceased to extradite to other countries those Germans within its possession who had been accused of committing war crimes. By 1953, all German war criminals in US custody would be eligible for parole. And by 1956, 1957, many of the most serious German war criminals would be released, including Joachim Peiper and members of Kampfgruppe Peiper, who murdered 84 American soldiers in the snows near Malmedy. None of their death sentences would be executed. None of them would hang. All of it would be quietly forgotten, at least until the French resistance goes and blows up Joachim Peiper to get their pound of flesh. Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a difficult problem at the end of the Second World War, which was how to deal with the brutality, the horror, the atrocity of the Second World War, which had been so immense as to be plain to any observer. How to deal with that legacy, how to find justice for its victims, how to hold soldiers in his and all other armies to account, while also setting the conditions for the Cold War in Europe to make sure the Western democracies would be able to stand in the aftermath of the Second World War and be positioned to maintain European security for the foreseeable future. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the United States government, the United States Army, chose to forget the excesses committed by the Wehrmacht, and they chose to forget their own excesses. The Wehrmacht could be clean, the United States Army could have fought the good war. Each organization could tell itself that its members had been correct and just in their use of force, that no further accounting was necessary, and that what had transpired between these two groups of soldiers could be left for soldiers alone to deal with. They were not to be responsible to the wider world, to its standards and mores, the concerns of the civilian populace, that this sort of killing was unacceptable under any circumstances. And so, we have forgotten the nature of the Second World War, that which was plain to any combat soldier, and what any combat soldier would have told you was the nature of that war as early as 1946. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Benjamin. That was wonderful, and it was also very very thorough and very thought-provoking, really. The filmmaker Per Lorenz made a film of Nuremberg, the Nuremberg trial. There were 150 hours of film that was made, and then they boiled it down to about an hour. And that film was shown in Germany, but it was banned in the United States for 65 years. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that plays into what you're talking about here?
I will confess that I'm not familiar with the nature of that, of either that film or the dynamics that are at play there. I wouldn't want to speculate, so I apologize. I'm gonna have to punt on that one.
No worries. It ties in very well with what you were just saying. The idea was the rehabilitation of the Germans to be our friends now against the Russians, and in the Cold War and such. Where did you find the information for this? Now, if you say these guys after the war they dispersed, or as the war was coming to a close, and some of the records were destroyed because they were not historically significant. So where did you find the information for this?
So there are a few places. There are more surviving archival records than one might suspect. A number of these major cases make it high enough up into the hierarchy, get to Eisenhower's desk, for instance, that there are still traces available. And if you can find the names, you can get access to the court-martial records. And so what I've done is I've managed to collate a number of these and to pull them together and to begin to look at them as sort of forming a pattern. The other place that you can find material is, of course, the large number of memoirs, oral histories, accounts of soldiers themselves, who, again, will tell you quite frankly what kind of war it was that they fought as early as 1946 and moving all the way up to the present day. These oral histories contain really endless accounts of the execution of prisoners, less frequently the execution of civilians, and some very frank assessments of what the nature of modern war is, and some claims about the comparable tendency towards atrocity between American and German forces. Now, I should clarify that when they're talking about that, they don't mean Auschwitz or the concentration camps, for which there is simply no equivalence, nor to the brutal reprisals against civilians like those that take place at Ladis or at Ursiglain, where German forces will round up hundreds of people in a village, kill them all, and then burn the place to the ground. But between soldiers, the tendency to perhaps dispatch groups of prisoners or individuals who are surrendering, the tendency not to accept surrenders during heated fighting. Many of them will say that there was an equivalence in those particular categories, and a number of them will even go so far as to say that they did not understand why the United States heaped such opprobrium on Joachim Peiper and his men for Malmedy, because they felt it was not such an exceptional occurrence, other perhaps than its scale. So those are the three main sources: your oral histories, your archives, your investigations, court-martial cases.
Now, in those oral histories where these guys are recounting these atrocities that occurred, is there any hint of like, what's the demeanor that they're describing this? Is it like, well, that's the way it was, what could you do? Was there any hint of regret, remorse, guilt, any of that?
So in general, we don't usually have accounts from the perpetrators themselves. Generally speaking, the accounts that we have are from those who witnessed or were peripherally involved with the events as they unfolded. You see sort of three main categories. There are those who recount this as being the horrors of war, as being something that they saw that they thought represented sort of the moral debasement that war forces the soldier into. Others took a more neutral tack on it, that this was simply the nature of what war was, that this is what people do in war, that these are the inevitable things that happen anytime you have two groups of armed men trying to kill each other. And of course, the last group, which I'm glad to say is probably the smallest, are those who were enthusiastic or unrepentant about such killings, and who stated positively that this was the kind of war that needed to be fought, and that this is what a winning army does, and that this is what victory in modern combat entails. So you have a range. I think probably the neutrals are the largest group. Those with either moral enthusiasm or moral objections to such killings are the smallest.
Did Eisenhower ever revisit that? He sort of seems almost like it was he made that distinction between the higher up Nazis and the regular Joe guys on the ground, and we're not quite sure where that delineation occurred. But did he ever regret that or revisit that or talk about that again later?
So I'm not familiar with all of Eisenhower's voluminous writings and speeches, so I cannot say definitively whether he revisits the question specifically. But at least at the time, he and much of the American officer corps sees a distinction between small, minor war criminals and major war criminals. That a soldier who, in the heat of battle, loses his temper and uses his weapon on someone who's in the process of surrendering, or an enlisted man who follows an illegal order, but who may not know any better or may be under pressures within the unit or within the conflict. Generally speaking, Eisenhower and other senior commanders have a lot of sympathy for that, both in their own army and as a matter of professional courtesy for those soldiers in other armies. It's once it reaches a certain point, once you begin executing groups of 50 or 100 or 200 people, or once you start taking violent action against large groups of civilians, they begin to see a distinction. That is no longer simply, in their mind, an inevitable byproduct of combat, but something that becomes a criminal and that needs to be dealt with more firmly.
Did the results of this inform in any way how these things were seen in the wars that followed, Korea, Vietnam, those sorts of things, or did they approach those incidents that occurred in those wars as sort of a a fresh approach given that particular war?
So the nature of the outcome here, which is to say functionally that this never happened, means that there's very little institutional learning in the Army itself. Now, there's, of course, the old folk stories, and I assume, based on what you see from Korea and Vietnam, that there are tales that are passed down from one generation of soldiers to the next, that these problems are not seen as entirely fresh. But the Army does not vastly overhaul its laws on these issues, does not take the kinds of safeguards that you might imagine to deal with problems that will emerge in Korea and Vietnam. Though I think what is perhaps most interesting is that when atrocities occur in those later wars, the American public retains quietly and out of the mainstream a memory of the sorts of things that went on in World War II. And you will see in Vietnam and to a lesser extent Korea, when these atrocities are brought to light, that there is a segment of the population that says, my uncle, my grandfather fought in World War II. And what's going on in Vietnam is not so different, other than the fact that my grandfather didn't have people following him around with a camera to watch everything that he did. There is a contention, some made by veterans of the Second World War, that there isn't much difference between those conflicts. And so there is a degree of sympathy in Vietnam amongst the public for members of the United States Armed Forces that commit these war crimes. And you can see that in things like the Ballad of William Calley or the mass outpouring of support for some of the men who were implicated in the My Lai massacre and some of the other smaller war crimes cases that emerged from Vietnam.
As you've developed this and done your work and writing, this is not a popular, I would imagine, perspective. We have Brokaw's Greatest Generation, and we were the good guys, they were the bad guys. But you're kind of lifting the edges of this and sort of saying, well, there might have been some bad guys on our side as well. So how is that? Have you encompassed that, or has it been sort of this? Well, it was war. That's what you got to do.
I think that I get less pushback on it than you might imagine, and some of that is that I'm fortunate enough that I work for the United States Army and that I deal a lot with soldiers who tend to have a less shiny view of what a conflict on this scale entails, and to understand that not everyone who wears the uniform is a knight in shining armor, and that combat leads people down dark paths and leads people to justify things that they might not otherwise do in peacetime. I would also say that I think that in popular culture, there has been more of a memory of this sort of thing than is commonly understood. If you watch many of the major war movies, The Longest Day, Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, Fury, God help you if you want to go down that road, right? You will see these kinds of behaviors committed by American troops, and those depictions come from somewhere, which is that people are reading the memoirs of the soldiers who fought this, or remembering the accounts of their relatives who fought in this war. And I will tell you that I've had on more than one occasion, I've given one of these talks, and someone has come up to me afterwards and told me a story about something that was told to them in confidence by a member of their family. I had a class that I taught, the young woman, her grandfather had been an air traffic controller in the war. And she was not someone who was much interested in military history, and she went, after we did our readings on World War II, to ask him what he had done in the war and why he had been where he had been. And he told her that the reason he was an air traffic controller was that he had had an older brother who had been a combat engineer, and that while on leave, that older brother had told her grandfather about an incident where they had been driving in a half-track, and it was relatively late in the war, things were not looking good, the Germans were trying to surrender, and they were driving and they saw a group of Germans who were looking to surrender. And so one of the Americans got out and he said in a very loud voice, "Boy, I sure hope there aren't any Germans around here, something bad might happen to them." And the Germans got the gist of it, and they all went and hid in a haystack so that the Americans could pass them on by and that things would proceed apace. The individual who shouted that comment then proceeded to get behind the wheel of the half-track and drive it at full speed into the haystack and crush the men to death. And so my student's granduncle told his brother, under no circumstances should you join the engineers. Under no circumstances should you join the infantry. Get as far away from the front line as you can. And that's how he became an air traffic controller.
In the American Marines and Army in the Pacific Theater.
So I've looked a little bit at this topic, and I haven't done an inter-service comparison specifically looking at the Marines and the Army separately per se, but I have looked at differences between the theaters. and I will say, and this is perhaps not a popular opinion, but I think there's less difference between, the Pacific has generally been depicted as a more brutal conflict. And I think that there's been less of a difference between those two theaters than has perhaps been popularly assumed. There are ways in which the Pacific is unique. Americans will take trophies, skulls, ears, teeth in a way publicly that they do not in the European theater. So Roosevelt, for instance, will be presented with a letter opener made from the forearm bone of a Japanese soldier as an official gift, and he has to apologize to the Japanese government for taking this. Of course, there's the famous cover of Life magazine that has the girlfriend of a sailor with a Japanese skull sitting on her table as she sort of looks at it in the last poor Yorick kind of style. But if you look at the actual counts of killing of prisoners or civilians, there's less of a difference than you might think. And to the extent that there is a difference, I think much of it has to do with the close-in, intimate, brutal nature of the fighting that transpires in the Pacific. In Europe, you're able to fight across wide open spaces at different distances of hundreds of yards. You have the opportunities to surrender. In the Pacific, the way the Japanese fought on the defensive meant that they were often ambushing Americans at ranges of 10 meters or less, right? Firefights 50 meters and in. And there is a degree of interpersonal violence that transpires there, a degree of personal animosity that you generate when you can look the person who is trying to kill you in the eye, right? And this means that you are frequently not as forgiving in those heated moments as you might be at other times. But of course, you hear the same thing in Europe, that if there's close-in house-to-house fighting, the incidents that I talked about in the 45th Infantry Division with Horace West at the Biscari Airfield, he maintained, officers involved in that maintained, that George S. Patton told them that if the enemy continues to fight after you close within 200 yards, take no prisoners. And generally speaking, once the fighting closed to within 150 or 100 yards, the number of prisoners that are taken, unless people are coming out in very large groups with no weapons and making it very, very clear what they intend to do, a lot of people don't wind up getting to the prisoner of war cages. So I think that there's less of a gap than has been popularly assumed between those two conflicts.
Benjamin, can you tell us a little bit about you? I mean, we've heard about your work. It's fabulous, but we want to hear a little bit about your experiences as a young emerging scholar. How did you decide to write about this, and what led you into the field that you're into?
So this project has its genesis in some of the work that I did when I was an undergraduate. I started off as a scholar of a student. Scholar would be giving me too much credit at that point. A student of the Holocaust and the Eastern Front, and so I had, of course, read a number of the works that were then current on perpetrator motivation, why it is, how it is that people can do such horrible things to each other. And when I was starting out on my doctoral work, I looked at a biography of Patton by a man named Stanley Hirschson, and it contained in it an account of the Biscari Airfield massacre. And I looked at the events that had transpired there, where Horace West and John Compton executed or arranged the execution of 72 Italian and German POWs. And I thought about all the explanations that I had read for why such behaviors transpire. And I realized that nothing that I had read seemed to offer a satisfying reason why it was that something like this should occur in the United States Army. That so much of the existing literature on atrocity was focused on totalitarian states, Germany, Russia, Japan, and that we didn't seem to have a good explanation for why this might occur in a democratic army fighting against people of the same racial category, each white, each Christian, that nothing seemed to offer something satisfying to me. And so I wanted to pursue that question and to begin to see whether this had been an aberration or whether it had been more common, and why it was that it had transpired. And that led me to questions of military justice, how often this happened, and that's how I wound up going down that road.
Advice would you give emerging scholars? I mean, you've been in the field now for quite some time, and let's say if somebody finds themselves at a crossroads of why am I doing this, or I've been in this trench for so long. What keeps you motivated? What gets you going? What advice would you give to that person?
That's a much larger conversation about where history is at this point. if you are already on the side of having your first job, I would tell you keep at it. Try to remember what it is that motivated you. You know, some people will tell you that they get tired of their topics. I wake up every day excited to talk about war crimes, which is horrible, but also true. If you're a graduate student or thinking of becoming a graduate student, the nature of the job market right now means that I don't have such happy things to tell you, but that's probably a darker and grimmer conversation than anything that has preceded to this point. And so I'm not going to go down that road. It's not great out there, folks.
Do you see that changing anytime soon?
No, I don't. This doesn't make me feel good to have to say, but I think that academic history, at least if your goal is to get a professorship, is not a great bet right now. There are a lot of other things that you can do with a history degree and other places that you can go. I will say that the people that I've known who've been hardworking and talented in the field have generally landed on their feet. And so I think that it's not the apocalypse, but I would say that the traditional vision of getting a Ph.D. and finding a tenure track position at a civilian university shortly thereafter is not a realistic option for most people at this point. There are other places that you can look. I was lucky enough to find a position with the United States Army, who are still hiring historians that do military history. They've been very good to me, but that's not necessarily an option for everybody, depending on your field of study.
So what's your next project, Benjamin?
So I have a set of 3 interlocking projects, which is probably too ambitious, but they all get at the same sort of stuff. I'm going to move up to Vietnam next, because I'm really interested in how, as you asked about earlier, how some of this translates or doesn't into what transpires in the Vietnam War. Speaking to your question on the Pacific, I want to use some of that research on Vietnam to look at the American War in the Pacific and the American War in Vietnam in a comparative context, to begin to try to isolate some of the factors that lead to different patterns of atrocity in different conflicts, and then to speak to some of the stuff that I've said about the popular memory and history of this war. I want to take a look at the trial of William Calley, and most specifically the popular reaction to it, because I think that there are a number of different currents of memory about these sorts of events that we don't generally think of, and that when My Lai happens and when the Calley trial happens, there's a popular understanding of what these kind of crimes are, what causes them, and what they mean in an American context that I don't think anybody's explored yet. So that's probably way too much, and if I'm lucky, I'll get maybe one of those books written, but that's where I'm headed.
That's great. That's great. Thank you so much for being with us, Benjamin, and talking about this very sad but and disturbing, but nonetheless important topic. And I think the title "No Good Options" is really summarizes it beautifully. So thank you so much for being with us, and good luck with your service. Thank you for your service in the military, and good luck with your projects. I'm sure they're all gonna come through. It may take you a while, but you're gonna do it.
Thanks so much for your time and attention.
Thank you.